All right, comic people in the place to be. And he's back at Marvel. We got the creator of The Man with the Power of a Million Exploding Suns, creator of the Sentry. I like to call him Bob if you've watched the Thunderbolts, the new Avengers movie. He's also writing Captain Marvel Dark Past, and he's wrote acclaimed other stuff like Inhumans, and according to Bill Jemas, that he actually had the courage to write the greatest story never told in Wolverine Origins. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Jenkins.
Guys.
Yay! What's up, Mr. Jenkins?
How's it going, guys? How are you feeling today?
Oh, fantastic.
Beautiful. All right, well, I'm looking
Had a-
forward to chatting with you and ask me difficult math problems. We'll see if I can get them right.
Oh my goodness. Wait, let me put on a good Will Hunting for a second, and I'll see if I can get some equations up.
Yeah, I was lying. I won't be able to do the math, but anyway.
Yeah. But like if you read number one of Century, we talked about it before. It's ready to think about like psychology, and it's like I'm thinking about like Inception, Matrix level thinking with your writing, Paul. So all right, so let's load it up, man. So Century, but let's kick us off.
Well, Kenny, I think you said you wanted to start talking about his new release this month of Century #1. Is that? Do you want to ask the questions there first, and then I can get into the history of everything?
Awesome. So Century actually 2 is coming out. We have Robert, Bob, and I will have to ask. So you kind of threw us for a little loop in the beginning of #1, Paul. It actually says this takes place before Infernal Hulk, but from the photos, I don't know when exactly. Technically, it is before Infernal Hulk, but are you able to tell us when in canon Sentry is actually taking place? Or is this just a big mind game right here, Paul?
No, because I have no idea. Right, I would defer to the editors on that. I don't really know enough about like where the Infernal Hulk is in the timeline and all that kind of stuff. I didn't write that stuff. That was the editors, and that was something that they wanted to say. I think in large part because when we talked about me coming back to do Sentry, it was almost like, well, I want you to do what you do, that stuff you do. It wasn't necessarily tied into some other version of the Sentry. It wasn't tied in to things that had happened in other books. I think they had seen book #1 where we created the Sentry. Book #2 that I did with John Romita Jr. was very much the source material for the film. And I worked on the film as a consultant, And book #3 is really them just coming to me and saying, hey, that way that you write Sentry, we really like Sentry to be written that way again. And so I was sort of given a little carte blanche to do it the way that I understand it, because I think that's the way that people really respond to the Sentry in the comics. Sorry, I started you with a damn squib. I literally don't know the answer to your question.
Well, so I guess my question really about one of the first questions that I have is about Sentry, but more about the Sentry of or the I guess the psychology of writing him as a whole, because I've always been drawn to more of the psychologically written characters that have we know Marvel's characters all have real world problems, but Moon Knight, Henry Pym, the Incredible Hulk really kind of is a metaphor for multiple personality disorder too. So what's the draw for Sentry? Because I mean, Sentry's really kind of rooted in real world psychology, isn't he?
Yeah, there's a little context to put into that, Bud, right? The first thing you have to do is to work out like who I was before I became a freelance writer, because most people don't realize that I spent 5, 6, 7 years being an editor. I was Alan Moore's editor. I was Neil Gaiman's editor. I had done a lot of stuff that came across my desk that was much more along the more literary kind of stuff. And, I was the editor on Big Numbers, for example, and Big Numbers was an incredible book that Alan had written. It was almost his Kubla Khan. He wrote it, his big thing, but it never got finished. And I really chose to be a freelance writer. I actually was just on a podcast about it, about what happened with big numbers. And one of the things that I mentioned, which is true story, I was an editor in chief of a company in Cincinnati that wasn't, going to last. And I was over in Britain trying to persuade Alan to come work with us. But, I talked with him about his work. And when he explained to me how he thought, I said, well, that's kind of weird because I think like that, I mean, I'm not Alan Moore, right? But I told him, I see that. I see that the only way I want to tell a story is about the people. And the way that I put into my college lecture a little bit is this, none of us have flown around the city dressed in spandex, punching bad guys. We've never done that. We've never jumped from the top of a building. We don't do any of that stuff. That's the aspirational stuff that keeps us coming back. But we all have difficult relationships. We all either are dealing with our own mental health issues, especially in the structured society, or we have people we know who are dealing with pretty profound mental health issues. That's something that we will recognize. The Sentry came about because when I was writing or wanted to write for Vertigo, and I had just been accepted as the writer of Hellblazer from nowhere. I literally came from absolutely nowhere. I went to San Diego Comic-Con and I broke in, as I always say, the only way that you can't do it, by meeting the editor. And they had 25 established professionals, he told me, that they were selecting from, and they chose me, and I'd never written anything. But the way that I approached it was that I wanted to write about people. And so when I did Hellblazer, I wrote about my family. All of the characters in there are my brother's in there. Everybody I know is in there. And I pitched this idea for Our Man, and because I saw Our Man and I wanted to write more than just Hellblazer. And I thought that the idea that you could take a pill for 1 hour and then you couldn't take it for a day meant that the 23 hours after you took the pill, you would be going, I want that pill. It was a pure metaphor for addiction, or at least I could write that. Problem was that DC weren't willing to release Our Man into Vertigo. Vertigo weren't willing to publish superheroes, and DC weren't willing to let me do that kind of thing. But Karen Berger, who was the editor-in-chief of Vertigo, was very smart, and she said, I think you should make a character out of it. I just do a new one. And so I did, and that became the Sentry. And then DC rejected it, and then rejected it again, then rejected it for a third time. Marvel rejected it when I moved over, and then we won an Eisner with Inhumans, and they sort of couldn't reject what Jay and I wanted to do, which was the Sentry. So it's always been founded in psychology. It's all about like the human condition. It's certainly about and one of the things I happen to just kind of tweet something. I'm not very prolific online, particularly in terms of just always constantly pushing. But I did write something that I've kept ever since I said it, which is it's not about how powerful he is, it's about how vulnerable he is. It was always that way. And so I think that's the way that I've approached it. And I'm not so sure that other people have really approached it that way. And that's why he's had a very checkered history of, there's a giant kind of pile of stuff, sometimes a puddle of stuff with Sentry. And sometimes I sit there and I think, this is not about power scaling, and it's not about how, being crazy doesn't mean you stand in the back and go, whoa, I'm crazy. Instead, we should be looking at the mental health, the mental illness that he has, and that's what I tended to write about. That's always worked for the character.
I kind of like the idea of a character that is as powerful as a million exploding suns, but maybe might have trouble getting out of bed in the morning.
Yeah.
I just thought that was just such a draw to the character, and like as flawless as I feel like Superman is. I feel like Sentry is like a super flawed.
Yeah. And there might be one other thing that I think we've done with the Sentry that really I'm not quite sure if that applies to any other character, right? That for every action of the Sentry, there's an equal opposite reaction. We wrote about causality. We wrote about that kind of thing. And the hero's dilemma is almost like the trolley problem, right? If I've got a trolley going down in this track and there are two people on this track and I could switch it to go and run over one baby, would I switch it to run over the baby, or would I have it run over the two people? The trolley problem is an age-old problem where you have different variables about who's on the track, and it's never solvable, right? You can't solve the trolley problem. The thing about the hero's dilemma, though, is for most heroes, if they can save 10 people but then sacrifice 2, then that's what they have to do, and it's very difficult for them to sacrifice 2. The exception I always thought was Spider-Man. He would never accept that the 2 would go. He'd have to save all 12, and he would do anything he could to save all 12. But the Sentry is very different. The Sentry, you sacrifice 10 to save 10, like it's a completely equal thing. And I don't know that there's any other character that actually has that as part of their breakdown. If he does something good, the Void will do something bad. If he lets the Void do something bad, then he will be able to do something good. And it's a kind of a unique situation.
Well, that's the only Marvel character that I know of that has such an obvious dark side, right? So it's
Yeah.
like the dark side is an actual character. So I always thought, and even like I think throughout the time where it kind of took us a while to figure out that they were the same person too. So it was almost like you had to buy in to kind of continue and become a fan of the series too. So, you
Yeah.
know,
When they wanted to do the film, Jake Schreier, I worked, with him, and when we talked, he really wanted to do the origin that Jay and I had done. But unfortunately, it was a little similar to some outcome they'd had in a Spider-Man movie, and so they just couldn't do it. But the idea was, that he, they loved the idea that he had given up his heroism, which is the ultimate act of heroism, that nobody knew who he was, no one would ever know who he was, and he had given up his heroism to heroically save the world from the Void. And that's a pretty powerful aspect of his character, because I think that when I came back and I saw the way that he was being treated in some ways, I am very understanding and careful about the way that we talk about other creators, because everybody has their opinion, and I would never want to denigrate another creator. I spent my whole career, propping up creators. But it's okay for me to have an opinion that that's not what I would have done. And I would say that, I wouldn't have done this thing where he kind of stands back and does the crazy. And it's the crazy, right? Like when I created him, I created a psychological profile that I sent to Marvel and said every writer should always follow this. It never happened, but I wish it had. You know,
Well, I noticed that even like when you introduced the Sentry, it was in Marvel Knights. There was all the spin-offs and the one-offs that with the X-Men and Spider-Man that kind of filled in those gaps. And then we didn't see him for a while. And then he got brought back for New Avengers. In fact, they even brought you into the issue as a character in the story. I always kind of wondered, like you say, not putting anybody down as for what they did at the time, but the direction with the Sentry, especially in Dark Avengers, took a more longer term into the past than I would have expected. That it was maybe from thousands of years ago or something, that this force of and I always kind of wondered if did Bendis talk to you about kind of ideas in the background, or was this kind of one of the, something that's kind of evolved out of it?
no, because I don't want to interfere with what somebody else does. I mean, he talked with me about
Yeah.
having me in the book as a character, and we talked a little bit. Like I seem to remember the way that it came about was that. And I have faced this, right? I have faced this with corporate creativity because, Marvel is a corporation, and so they have certain things that they have to look out for. And Brian and I were there when they were in bankruptcy, and then when they sort of were propelled out of bankruptcy. So they went from that bit where they kind of said to me, whatever it is that you do, just do it. Because that's the last resort of the creative corporation when they're really struggling, and they were in chapter 11. So they let me do whatever I wanted to do, and that was cool. But Brian talked to me and he said, they had told him there were no good new characters because he wanted a new character, and he's like, I don't get it. Why do you say that? There, the Sentry, we got this, we got that. So I wouldn't presume or want to particularly interfere with what another writer does. Let them do it, right? Brian did what he wanted to do. He talked with me about what I thought about my own character, right? But then I'm not going to sit there and look over his shoulder and edit his book, because he has editors for that and he has his own ideas, So he went off and he did the New Avengers. It did a different thing than I would do with a character. But let's be clear again. I'm not criticizing that it's different from what I would do. It's just I'm not Brian. So Brian writes in this way. And then when he's finished with it and there's other things, I actually wrote a second series, and I got to do what I really wanted to do with the Sentry very much so. Then I had a longer plan with him. and that was to write about how, in a sense, he wasn't that special, that he had this power, but it came, he had a problem. He had a lot of problems. He was an addict. He had, so it got me to go back to what I wanted to do with Our Man, actually, that he had an addiction issue and he had mental health issues. And they're like, you got Doctor Strange and Captain America and all these people, and they're like, this is the most dangerous entity in the universe, this guy. And so they're trying to use like what we described as cancer magic, like chaos, bad magic, or mind cancer magic, I think we called it, to persuade him that in fact he was just a resident of a mental health facility and that he never was the Sentry. And I was very proud of that series. I thought that was one that like, really kind of moved you around quite a lot. And it came to an interesting status quo at the end, and it showed you that he loved his wife, and he had his little dog, and the Hulk was his best mate, and he had a status quo that we could work with at that point.
It's one of the best things about the comics, especially with Sentry that you wrote, was it's one of those rare instances where you get sucked into that book, and you're kept guessing of what's going on, or is this the character I'm actually reading? You have to keep changing your mind about who it is you're reading about, and I think that's the best part of comics that I love, especially Sentry. And I thought. Maybe Brian was right when he said, there's, what do you mean there's no new good characters in Marvel? Because I thought Sentry was probably one of the better characters created over the last 20, 30 years. And I just can you take us back to the point where right before he's launched and you're kind of advertising that this might have been some character that maybe Stan Lee kind of dusted off or put in mothballs, and then you were taking him out of mothballs. Can you talk about that for a minute? As far as,
Yeah.
first of all, viral, like almost as viral as you can get as far as a marketing campaign, but would that work in social media today, do you think?
Oh, I think it'd be on steroids in social media at this point. Yeah, it would have gone off like through the ceiling, I think. If you can't predict sometimes whether something will go viral, but they would have put a lot into it. So to refresh anyone's memory that doesn't know, what we said was that this was a lost creation of Stan Lee, and this came from the way that I had designed the character. I had created this whole thing. And there's a lot more to it, right, than you guys actually know. And I'll explain a little bit of like what was going on. So let me see if I can find the right starting point. In the story, he doesn't know that he's a superhero, and he's forgotten that he used to be the Sentry. So he begins to remember his time as the Sentry, but there are flashbacks to comics that start around 1961, like 2 weeks before the first Fantastic Four comic. So he's the original guy. And so I made him, Reed Richards' best friend and so on. So, what I did was make it so that I love the idea that when a character's trying to remember something that happened and they can't quite remember it, they remember it in comic book form. So there's this great and very sweet little bit where he comes into, and it says in the caption, it says, Robbie discovers the professor's secret formula, and his thought balloon, like it would be in the 60s, says, gosh, this must be the professor's secret formula. And on the vial, it says, Professor's secret formula, right? Just so you know it. And I thought, yeah, that's like a memory. It's like a memory that's not quite complete. So we took all of these memories he had that were resurfacing in him in terms of the way we told the story, and we made them the bits of his identity coming back until he fully remembers the Watchtower and that he's the Sentry. Marvel loved that, and they had this fantastic idea that what we would do is we would say, look, he's too dangerous to remember in the story. So why don't we make him too dangerous to remember in real life? That's the way that we're going to get this series and people to pay attention to it. And the idea was that I fictionally go to the Marvel offices after working on Inhumans, and Jay and I are being asked to do any book we want to, basically. It was really kind of like that at the time. And I think Jay really loved Namor, and we were actually talking about going on to Namor. But in a fictional manner, I go to studios and I'm rooting around and I find these old folders and I take them home and no one knows what they are. And I'm looking at them and they're like, oh no, this looks cool. And wow, I've discovered an old comic by a guy called Artie Rosen that Stan used to work with Artie. And so we had this whole thing where Wizard Magazine, who was very prominent at the time, you know, Joe Quesada or somebody interviews Stan Lee and he's like, yeah, I remember Artie. I loved him. He's a great guy. I don't remember doing that character though. That must be the forgotten one that we didn't know. And so they did this whole thing with Stan. They did the whole thing with Joe. They printed the Artie Rosen. They printed an obituary for him, and his wife Blanche had found Blanche Rosen. It's a great name. Had found these old files and sent them in, and I grabbed them, and then I looked at them, and then so on. So for an entire year before the Sentry came out, people were losing their minds. Oh my God, you found the lost Stan Lee creation, Artie Rosen and Stan back again. After all these years. They really, really fell for it. I think the picture that we had of Artie Rosen was literally a picture of Nancy DeKeesian, who's Joe's wife, Nancy's grandfather in his Navy uniform.
Oh, wow.
Name Artie Rosen came because I said, we should. I remembered Artie Simek and Joe Rosen were the old letterers who really, were in there but never got their props. So let's make Artie Rosen. It sounds great. It's perfect. And so, that whole thing came about. And then for an entire year, they trotted me out of conventions to tell this story. And I'm horrible at it. Joe Quesada's P.T. Barnum. He can do it. Hey, yeah, this is what happened. Tell him, Paul. And then it would kind of come to me and I go, so what happened? I was awful at it, right? They're really good at it. But what it did was it made people so excited. And then we told them what the spoof was. And some people got angry and some people that was brilliant, but it didn't matter because they were talking about the Sentry and they were talking about Sentry. And so, history tells us the rest.
I think about pre-internet being able to pull something like this off. I think the Sentry revelation of what you just said and who the Thunderbolts were in 97, you couldn't do that today. There'd be so much leaking going out there. I loved how that went off at the time. It was great.
Yeah, there might be leaking. I guess, we would have had to do it differently, but I did think it was pretty fun. They could have leaked. I mean, we were at conventions for an entire year and it could have been told to somebody there, but it never really did and it never got out. So then when we came through with what really had happened, I think people actually quite admired it it's quite clever, really.
Very clever.
I thought it was great, and I loved how you got different art teams to come in and do the retro stuff, and you guys made it look so Silver Age. I was I would have been fooled,
Yeah.
I'm just.
So I want to tell you something that is. You talked about psychology and the way that I write and the way that I approach books. So there's actually some subtext under there. There's some stuff that I did underneath using old comics that if I tell you now and you've never actually understood this before, you'll go, oh my God, I didn't really see that, but I get it. I thought that the evolution of the comics industry, remember, he's an addict and he has this serum. And so in the comics, he goes into his study and he's like, oh, the super serum. I haven't thought about that in years. The Sentry serum or whatever, But then 10 minutes later in the comic, he walks back in again and takes another bit. I haven't thought about this in years. And you're like, hang on a minute, this guy's got a problem, right? He's obsessed over his Sentry suit that hangs in the closet. And then when he goes there, it's just an old brown jacket with a towel close pegged to the back, like a cape. And you're immediately convinced, this guy's clearly not right. And then he walks outside and walks up into the sky and you're like, what is going on, right? But the comic thing was really useful because what I realized was that you start with the comics of the 50s and 60s, right? This is where it's all created. This is where it all begins. In the 70s, it becomes like hippie comics. You got crazy psychedelic stuff going on. Anything goes, right? In the 90s, in the 80s, it comes into the era of Alan and other people like him. It's very much like, Dark Knight Returns. It's like this gritty, grim, things come really realistic, they come back down to earth. In the 90s, it became guy throws a punch and it goes through the back of the other guy's skull and knocks his skull out the back. It was video nasties, they would have called it in those days. It was really brutally kind of trying to one up each other. And the 2000s were set up for comics to recover. And that specifically mirrored a drug addiction. You create it, it starts, anything goes, then you come down to earth, then it gets really bad, and now you have to recover. The whole point of that was that the evolution of all of comics history mirrored a drug addiction, and that was intentional.
Huh.
Wow.
I kind of thought my comic collecting habit mirrored a drug addiction for a long time too.
It's bad habit, run away.
Don't ask our spouses. Oh boy.
Yep.
Mm. You mentioned earlier Jay Lee working with him on Inhumans. Can we talk a little bit more about relaunching kind of that propulsion you had mentioned out of bankruptcy with the launch of the Marvel Knights imprint and kind of a reimagining of the Inhumans, and what did you do differently with Inhumans?
There's this very specific thing that I did, that we did, that no one else did. They should have done it. They should always do it. And I wish they would do it, right? But before I get into the specific way in which we approach the Inhumans, I would say that I have my own slight superpower about comics. It drives everybody nuts. And that's that I don't know anything about comics. And it drives people crazy. I do. Obviously, I've worked with them long enough. I've seen enough comics, and I build out, in a particular way. But I'm constantly blown away by fans reacting to my work, saying, "Oh my God, he really understands these characters." And I'm like, "I've never seen that character before I wrote." But I would tell you that is not as cynical as it sounds. And I want to be clear, and I want people to understand that I care about my work. It's not that I don't care about comics. When they sent me the Inhumans to look at, it really came about because I think Jay had talked to Joe and Jimmy, and they came in to do this. They, we knew them from Event Comics, right? They weren't at Marvel. And Jay kind of calls me out. He goes, did you hear that Joe and Jimmy from Event have got a job at Marvel? And I was like, really? Wow. Okay. And he said, yeah, they asked me if I wanted to do a book, and I told them I wanted to do a book with you. Would you like to do the Inhumans? I said, yeah, that sounds great. Who are they? Never heard of them, because I don't know. And they sent me 2 5-page stories by Jack Kirby, and I intentionally said to him at the time, can that be it? I don't want to read a load of copies of Inhumans. I don't want to know. I can see exactly what I would do with it. Everything's a metaphor. Black Bolt is a metaphor for a king. He can't speak because his voice is so resonant that he blows a planet in half. Great. That's like a metaphor for the king of a country. You can't speak your mind, otherwise there'll be a constitutional crisis. And I think that we see with the fracturing of politics and all the stuff that's going on where people are just constantly yelling, that's exactly what would happen, right? So I use that as a metaphor. The children going into the Terrigen Mist was a metaphor for puberty. The Alpha Primitives was very much a metaphor for emancipation of Black America, because ultimately you're free but not free, right? You were freed and emancipated, yeah, but you didn't exactly get the same privileges, and that's what happened to the Alpha Primitives. And so I could see all of this was all right there, and I knew I could write that, and I knew exactly what to do. And when I pitched it, Marvel and Joe and Jimmy didn't have the space that they were allowed. They were upstairs in the penthouse. They were doing 4 issues, but 4 books. But you have to understand, of the 4 books that they did, 3 of them were successful, and 1 of them didn't really quite hit. The Punisher didn't quite hit. But Black Panther got done for 50 issues with Chris Priest. That's pretty good, right? For a tech, Daredevil sales went through the ceiling, and we won an Eisner. And so suddenly there was all this success because they brought in editors like Joe and Jimmy and creators like me. And they said, go do that thing, that wizardy stuff that you do. And they let us do it. That Joe and Jimmy, we had a couple of fights because I felt that Marvel was so entrenched at that point that they were looking at somebody like me and going, why are you here? There was actually kind of some overt comments made to me when I went to go see them, and I'm like, I don't want to say, but the book came out, and Kevin Smith's book came out with Joe and Jimmy, and it went gangbusters, and history tells us what happened. And then from that, because we'd won their first Eisner in quite some time, they said, whatever you want to do, you can do. And Jay and I said, yeah, we want to do the Sentry. And they're like, for God's sake, we've rejected that 4 times. But they let us do it because they had the sense to allow creators to do that kind of thing. And that's how we ended up being successful, largely because, and I always tell this anecdote, and it's actually kind of funny. I wrote Karnak the Shatterer. If you remember that character, he can touch a cup, and he finds out where the cup is weak, and he touches it, and it shatters. Right, Karnak the Shatterer. So he can see the flaw in anything. And I had him as the advisor to Black Bolt, because he could see the flaws in human society. And when it came out, the fans were like, "Oh my God, Paul Jenkins is the biggest genius of all time! What a great way to use Karnak!" And my answer was, "Oh, I thought that's what he did." Completely wrong. But I will tell you a very specific thing that we did. That is a writer. Like, to me, I'm a writer that happens to work in comics and film and television and video games. I work across different media, and they told me, well, Black Bolt can't speak. His voice is so resonant. I'm like, okay, great. So he never speaks. And in our book, he never spoke. Now, I went back and looked at all the ones before and all the ones since. Every single time, the comic guys in some ways want to go, let's have him speak so stuff can blow up. And I'm like, that's literally the opposite of what you're supposed to do with that character. And so what I realized was I had been told, nobody liked the Inhumans. And I think we were in issue 7 or 8. And the fans started writing in those days. There wasn't, much to write in terms of like message boards. There was nothing like that. And they started saying, when's he going to do something? I need him to go do something. Why is he waiting? Why is he waiting for the town to be blown up? And I thought, I gotcha. You never cared before. So we never had him speak. One of the things they told me was that he had never been defeated in battle, ever. And I thought it was such a shame that that they tried to follow on from our success in Inhumans. The very next one, they wrote, defeated in battle for the first time. And I thought, well, that's the only time. Now you've done that, you can never say that character was never defeated in battle again, because you don't have it anymore. That could have been an amazing story point you could have messed with for years, But they wanted that. It's like anti-instinctive to me, but I guess it's very comic-y in some ways,
Yeah, I will never see the Inhumans the same again after you explained that. Like, I understood the alpha primitives, but like, wow, that's crazy.
Yeah.
But sometimes you need that fresh perspective. You got guys that know every minutiae for 30, 40, 50 years.
Yep.
And then you sometimes can get lost in all those details, whereas a fresh perspective can come in like yours and just give it new life and new perspective. It was great.
Yeah, and I had these ways of doing things that probably didn't really fit in some ways. I think they were patient with me because we were relatively, I had some success. But for example, I feel very strongly that the comic industry needs to bring in new readers, right? I think it's very important. And one of the ways that I contributed maybe to new readers being given a chance was that I did single issues all the time. And it drove Marvel crazy. They used to say to me, you got to do these 5-issue stories. And I'm like, why? I want to do single issues. So I'll give you an example. We have done single issues about a little boy in Spider-Man. Let me just go to Spider-Man, for example.
Sure.
We did an issue about baseball in which a little boy, in which he goes to the baseball game every year with his Uncle Ben. And it's very meaningful. And I've had fans come up to me crying their eyes out, holding that book in 2 hands because it meant so much to them. One about a little African-American kid who believed he had a secret friend called Spider-Man, and it was his favorite character. And Spider-Man used to visit him. But what you realized was that Spider-Man's words were all the positive men in his life, the same words. So he had made this thing. We had one about poker. The World Poker Tour, a guy called Chris Moneymaker, who won the World Poker Tour, found that issue, lost his mind, got 100 issues, gave them out to all his poker buddies, and then I did an interview with Poker Magazine because they loved it so much. And the reason I wrote it was because I was watching poker on TV, and I thought, this is the ultimate hero versus villain. There's a bad guy and a good guy. I want the good guy to win, but this is as much of a hero-villain fight as anything I've ever seen. So we have all the heroes playing poker, and Kingpin shows up and gives everybody $1 million and says, I'm going to win your money back, and kind of does, but he's this close. And then Spider-Man beats him right at the very end. And you go, hooray, right? And so, single issues and having themes and having real recognizable themes was something that I did. And I think that you'll often see comics where the recognizable theme is, let's do giant robots blowing up. And it looks beautiful. It's wonderful to see, but I'm not so sure that we can really put a flag in there and say that belongs to my heart,
This resonates with me because single issue stories are my favorite things that almost don't exist anymore. Because everything is so written for the trade, I feel like you get your best characterizations from a one issue story. Whether it was one of those, if you think about Chris Claremont X-Men, those single issues where they fleshed out a supporting character or something were the best for me. And so I love that's what you like to do, because it's like, it sees another side of a character for a lot of people, and
You can
it brings in new readers.
right, and you bring in new readers, just give them that one issue. And my example was actually my wife. I'd say, look, I'm going to give you a reality to this. If I were to take my wife into a comic store and put a blindfold on her, spin her around, and then point her towards the wall and say, whichever comic you find first, that's the one you're going to read, she would absolutely, without a shadow of doubt, find a comic and then hate it because it was part 7 of 24, and she doesn't understand the self-referential stuff that and I'm like, look, you cannot ever care about the fight. Muhammad Ali was the greatest boxer of all time for a reason. He made you care about the two people in the fight, and then you cared about the fight. And so my job was to I love that level of writing, make people care about the people in the fight, make you care about Mindworm or some obscure Spider-Man character or whatever. And then I think that you could do something that had meaning. So we put that into, the series of Wolverine Origin. It was that Wolverine Origin series was about a little kid and how he grew up. And most of my Spider-Man work was about Peter Parker. It really wasn't about Spider-Man in some ways,
So those are my favorite Spider-Man stories, are the ones that are about Peter. So, and we're definitely going to touch on Wolverine in a minute, but I want to fast forward again to a Sentry question, and then I want to go in the Wayback Machine for a minute. My question about Sentry is, were there any challenges to you for coming back to write a character that you hadn't seen in a while? And was there anything new that you wanted to do with them that we haven't seen yet?
Yeah, we're doing something new in this series. I think that when you get to the end of the series, people will understand. They will be moved emotionally very much, I think, Um, I'm just keeping it together for a second. A good friend of mine passed away yesterday of cancer, and but he's
sorry
a
to hear that.
very well-known person in the comic industry. He owned the Laughing Ogre in Columbus, Ohio. He was the main guy there, a guy called Gib Bickle. And we have, I mean, now it's known in the preview, that in issue number 2 of Sentry, it becomes clear that his dog has cancer. And so, when I came back, I have 1,000 stories I could write. I've already pitched 2 more series to Marvel and said, well, we should be using this character as an ongoing kind of story, I believe, that is the character that deals with mental health issues. And here's my first story, and this is why it's so beautiful and it means something. And here's my second story, and it will break, but this one will just kill people. It will hurt to read. And I know it, right? I know exactly how emotional it is. I've seen the artwork all the way through to halfway through issue 4 now. Christian's just finishing up issue 4. And I've seen the rafts and I know what the story is. And I'm telling you right now, there's something that happens for Sentry or with Sentry that when I saw the way he had been used in the last 15 years, I thought, man, why crazy bastard that stands on the sidelines being crazy and twirling his mustache, you know, whoa, I'm the void, and doing mean things for no apparent reason, right? That's not mental health issues. That's the most naive version, in my opinion. That's like that's like the landlord from a 1920s Laurel and Hardy movie, right? It's not particularly um indicative of people struggling with mental health issues, right?
Well, it's the easy way out.
It's the easy way out,
Yeah.
right? It's the easy way out. And so where I felt that there needed to be something for Sentry was, and I don't want to spoil the book, but there's something that we do with Sentry that is now maybe, you know, a new approach, a new wrinkle for him, a different way of being, right? Because we're all trying to move forward in our lives. We're all trying to, you know, if you're struggling with mental health issues and you know it, don't you want to also maybe address it? Plenty of people with mental health issues address their mental health issues. So why is he never written as though he wants to address it? And I just was like, let's do this, you know, let's do something more with him. So that's part of the way that I've approached him, and I think it's different. And I know that this will break some people's hearts, and I know that it's worth it an issue for.
I'm gonna have to go out and get it. Ken, you're gonna have to get
I,
it up. Get it for me.
it's like I
Send it to me.
said, you'll get it. Like it's like, oh, like you're trying to dig into his previous writing, and then if you read his blog, you read it again and like, what? It's crazy. But yes,
Yeah, there's a lot of thought that I put into work, and you know, I can't speak for any other writer. I can't, but you know, I was trained as an editor before I was a writer, and I studied to be a filmmaker before I came to America and met the Ninja Turtle guys. And so, you know, I had all these other things that are part of the way that I create. And I'm not a massive consumer of comics. I'm not a massive consumer of television, and I never watch TV. Really, I'm the guy. You know, look at what I do. Right? I've never seen Breaking Bad. I've never seen Game of Thrones. I'm not interested, right? I'm busy making. And so what I do is I live a really interesting life and I write about it. I observe what's happening. I know nothing about Game of Thrones. I know nothing about any of the things that people are all excited about. And that's fine. That's just for me, right? That's
Yeah.
just the way that I do my work, which is I don't consume tons and tons of other media in order to be able to do my work.
That's amazing. That stuff that I read from you seems so original, where if you don't know what's out there, you know, it's like sometimes I
Yep.
feel like some stuff's already done by accident, you know.
I do it consciously. I consciously don't consume a bunch of other stuff so that I can have a maybe a different eye or a different voice in the way that this stuff works, you know. And it so it applies to Sentry. Sentry comes this series that we're doing now applies only to the way that I imagine he must be and live with his life, but it doesn't refer to something that happened in Daredevil number 107.
Mhm.
It's just I don't know how to do that. I don't want to do that.
Do you think a character with mental illness is more acceptable now than it was when you even first came out with the character 20 years ago? I mean, I kind of feel like there's such a drive to be accepted as far as you know, people on medications, or people bipolar, people with depression syndromes or whatever, you know. It's like,
Yeah. I don't feel any different about it. I feel the same now as when I created the character, right? I haven't had to change because, you know, people have some kind of internet pity party or some internet, you know, pitchfork mob to make us do things. I don't care about any of that. I don't. But I believed that the story of mental health issues was the story of every person that read it. You tell me you haven't had a bad day. That bad day that
wow,
you had was an attack on your mental health. You tell me you don't have a family member or even yourself that deals with some kind of mental health issue. You know, that's a story that's so untapped. We have to be telling these stories, and so Sentry seems like a really good vehicle to do it. You know.
no,
I will
I
confess
think so
something.
too.
I have to confess something on this. So, like, doing my real job, I work in healthcare, and I had a friend that went through a mental health spat, and you know, you said with the Sentry, he would just call me at like 1 o'clock in the morning, 1 a.m., and be like, I do not know where I'm at, and I would like just and like close friend, and I would say, just find something I can use as a landmarker, and I'll come get you. I will find you. I will be that hero, and find you no matter
Yeah.
what. And that's why I feel close to the Century, just because, you know, I went through that with a friend of mine.
Yeah.
It's great.
I'm working on Captain Marvel again, and we'll probably get to that in a second. But one of the things that I think that I like about the way that I do it, or the thing that attracts me, maybe I can't compliment my own work, but more say this is why I'm interested in. I'm so interested in what happens when you take away these people's powers. Who would they be anyway? Bob is trying, right? He's trying really hard, and he's very intelligent. He's an artist. You know that he draws. You know he's intelligent because he made the Watchtower with Reed Richards. He's a nerd, right? He loves stuff like that. So we've got that in the book. Spider-Man, to me, I always used to say, would be a teacher if he wasn't. He would have been a teacher, right? And so you get these characters, and the way that I'm doing Captain Marvel right now is like I got a chance to see her character, and sometimes I felt it was written like some dude's version of feminism, right? And I always thought that was kind of like a bit naive. That really what you need to look at is she's she'd been a pilot, she'd been military intelligence, she'd been editor-in-chief of she'd been investigative reporter and editor-in-chief of Women's Magazine, and she had been the head of security at NASA, right? So take away her powers, she pretty accomplished person. And if a villain strips away her powers, what would she do? She'd still fight back, right? That's what you need these characters to be. Take their powers away, they still would do this stuff. That's why they're really interesting and heroic, And in my case, I like the idea that sometimes they're flawed and they're not perfect. Because if you just write them as perfect, what's the point? Might as well write a deity at that point,
He's right, Superman.
Yeah.
So the Wayback Machine, you just mentioned a minute ago the Ninja Turtle guys, and so I kind of wanted you to talk about your beginnings in the industry and your editing. You were editing for Mirage Studios, and you did you say you helped the licensing deals of initially? Was that right?
So let me tell you like what my role was, because nobody had a role, right? It blew up and we went like, what is happening?
Right.
And we just did not know. The simplest way of putting it, I'd come over to the States. I met the guys that had a black and white comic book, and it ended up being Ninja Turtles, and they sold the rights to a toy and TV. And I was a musician. They did an album cover for my band. And we were going to go on tour in the Northeast, but I broke my leg playing football like I normally do. That's a lifelong. Everyone that knows me personally is like, which break, like which one of the 20 you've done? And so I had broken my leg, and we couldn't tour. And I, now I'm on crutches, and I sort of said to them, guys, I know you're really busy. Any chance you could give me a job? And they went, yeah, we really need some help. So I come in, and they've got an office manager and a guy that does the licensing, and then me. And I not really have a training. It's not like I'm trained in comics, but they're like, you're in charge of the publishing. I'm like, great, got it. And it's how I learned. But when you're that young, I was very, very young. You sink or you swim. I mean, when you have a maelstrom like the Ninja Turtles that happens around you, and it blows up, and Kevin's stuck in the middle of it, and Pete's stuck in the middle of it. Now, understand the money comes in, and now you've got a million new best friends, and they're all knocking on the front door, and they're all doing crazy, nefarious things, and you're trying to keep your head above water. And in that environment, as a young kid, the office manager was legally blind. She couldn't see in front of her face.
Oh my God.
She was a nice lady, but she couldn't see. And the licensing guy had a pretty horrendous drug habit. Couldn't, he was the liaison. He was struggling with it, and he just was pretty messed up guy. And so I am now stuck in an office of 3 people, of which I'm the only one that's somewhat competent, and I'm 22, 23, maybe. and all this stuff's happening. But what ended up happening was, like, when, say, Kevin would walk in, especially Kevin, right? I was very friendly with Pete. I was very friendly with Kevin, but they would walk in, and these poor guys, they both were so humble about it. And they would say, they'd be the first person, Kevin, one of the first times I met him, he said, yeah, I'm just a lobster cook from Maine and I got lucky and now look what's happening, right? So he was overly humble, and Pete was very similar. Pete was a little more quiet. Kevin was very gregarious, very outgoing. And after a brief period of time, what I started trying to do was to make sure that the licenses that we were getting from Surge Licensing, who were the licensing agent, were being signed properly, and that this guy was not messing their stuff up, and stuff was getting stolen from the toy cupboard. So I got the key and I was like trying to keep the toy cupboard locked, and you know, we had all of these cell shaded paintings. I think we got like for each issue, each episode of Ninja Turtles, we got 10 of them, and they would all go missing, and it was crazy, right? I'd get phone calls at my home and it'd be like 3 o'clock in the morning, and they'd say, is this Paul Jenkins? Yeah. Paul Jenkins works for Mirage Studios. Yeah. Have you ever considered investing in such and such? I'm like, no. Go away.
Wow.
And so it was a massive, and so I began to try to take an interest in making sure that the licensees were looked after. So I'll give you some examples, and if any of you remember this stuff, you'll probably specifically go, oh my God, was that you? We had the little square drinks, right? And the guys who do the licenses are the Old Boys Network. They're the same people for the Ninja Turtles, Muppets, Transformers, you name it. It's the same licensee. So if you make plastic swimming pools for Transformers, you've got the Ninja Turtle license, but you don't really know what you've got. So the drinks guy kind of calls up, and I talked to him for a minute, and he said, yeah, you know, my grandkids like this thing, but I don't know what it is. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles doesn't make any sense to me. And I said, I'll tell you what, man, here's how to do this, right? I don't know if people like red punch, but you make one of them red punch, you make one of them blue raspberry, you make one of them orange flavor, you make one of them grape flavor. Now you got the Ninja Turtle colors. And I'm telling you right now, even if red punch isn't popular, make 3 times as much of that as everyone else, because all the kids love Raphael, right? That guy
True.
called me a year later and he was like, oh my God, young man, you made me so much money. Because he was like, you know, and there was you know, we'd have the electronic talking toothbrush and crazy stuff like that. And we would, you know, the artists that would come in would design the toys. So we had an in-house group of people, and we had a Bible that made sure that people didn't go out. There was a guy who tried to make the plastic pools, and he made substandard artwork, and he never got it approved. And then he shipped it into America from China, and he got it done on the cheap. So he saved himself a little bit of money on the art, and he lost a fortune, because we were like, you are never ever sending that to Walmart. You're not destroying our license with this substandard artwork. And so we accidentally, because we were kids, managed to help keep that license on the straight and narrow.
That's an unbelievable story.
Yeah, it's crazy. I will tell you, there's a really funny one. I'll give you that one funny anecdote. So there's 1,000 of them, right? One that occurs to me is, did any of you ever see the Ninja Turtles pinball machine? Did you ever see that? Remember this?
Absolutely.
So,
Yep.
yeah.
So, depending on whether anybody ever sees the graphic, it's fair to say that April O'Neil is rather a statuesque young lady. She's quite busty in this. She has boobs probably bigger than her head on the pinball machine, and that probably put a lot of young boys through school for many years, because that image was quite out there. And the way that happened was they had sent in the artwork, and and I was looking at it, and everyone was so busy that sometimes I'd have to look at artwork because the other licensing company doing it. And I looked at it, and the artwork sitting right in front of me, and I was like, yeah, the way they've drawn her is not really actually the way that she appears in the cartoon. She's super flat-chested here. In other words, she looks like a little bit of a boy. And so I'd written a note to say, hey, she is a young woman, so you need to do some boobs a bit, not. Okay. So I draw this W where they need to address it. They took the actual W that I drew, made it that big.
Ooh.
You were like,
Wow.
what happened? So I have all these anecdotes about that, all this stuff about like being on set, like going down to the film and trying to keep them on the straight and narrow, and being on set. I was on set when Vanilla Ice was on set, for example, and that was mad. So crazy days. But I think, guys, you either sink or swim, and I could swim. That's all. That's all it was.
Can you do the dance though? The go ninja, go ninja, go.
I cannot and will not.
He might break something.
Yeah.
So question for you, the kind of being the baptism by fire of Mirage Studios, that basically gave you the confidence and the power to do basically any other job in the industry, right? I mean,
Yep.
you've been done pretty much everything.
Yeah. What it did was, one day Kevin came to me and he said, I want to do a creative, he knew. Okay. So, I never used to talk about this. I didn't think it was important. Now I'm okay with talking about it. I just came from humble beginnings like no one else. My family, my dad left when I was 5 and I grew up, in the countryside. Sometimes we lived in a caravan. Sometimes, a couple of times I've been homeless. We lived in a farmer's cottage, and if you've ever read The Origin of Wolverine, you know that farmer's cottage where he's looking up the hill with the farm with the lights on. That's literally autobiographical, right? I was the kid at the bottom of the hill, and so because I didn't care about money, I didn't care about trying to acquire money that didn't belong to me. There's actually an anecdote. Kevin is such a generous. Kevin Eastman's such a generous guy. And he's only ever been absolutely furious at me twice. And the first time he got furious at me was because they did very well. And they gave a big bonus to everybody. And I gave it back. And I could have used the money, I'm sure. But I gave it back and I said, Kevin, this just seems like mad. And what was happening was a lot of the people there were comparing what bonus they got and did they get as much as the other person. And it was causing problems. And I said, Kev, you could have given me a big turkey, and for a Christmas bonus. But I feel, and this has stood us in good stead over the years, right? I said, mate, I feel there's just this thing that's happening around us where everybody's talking about money and wondering about money and trying to get money and money. And I said, it seems to lead to so many problems for you sometimes, mate, and especially giving money to people that you care about and then getting disappointed. So I can't take this. I can't take this money. I'm sorry. And he was fucking livid with me about it. But I asked him, do you think, like maybe that, that, we'll remain friends. What do you want? Friendship and I was probably too pushy, right? I was really young and I'm being too pushy and saying, you want to be mates in the future or do you want to give me something that you'll resent me for? And he got pissed, right? But guess what? I ended up singing at his wedding. He remains one of my greatest friends in the world right now. That approach to it was probably right, I think. And so one day he says to me, hey, listen, I'm going to start a new publishing company and it's for the benefit of creators. It's called Tundra Publishing. And I would love you to come over. And I can't pay you what you're going to earn at Mirage. And I went, I'm in, because I didn't like the money running around. And so we went over and we opened the doors at Tundra and sort of closed them. It was a crazy time, but I eventually became editor-in-chief there, head of production, director of editorial. Crazy, I'm like a kid still. I'm 25, 26, and and then so I had done all of that stuff, a lifetime's worth of stuff, before I became a freelance creator, and that really helped me.
So do you think moving to the writing was kind of because you had like editorial burnout maybe, or?
No, I knew I was creative. I studied to be an actor and I studied filmmaking. I was probably not going to be an actor, but I was going to be a filmmaker. And then I come to America. I'm teaching music and drama to learning disabled children. So I'm a musician as well. And I run into Ninja Turtles now. I find myself somehow embroiled in whatever this thing is, licensing comics, pick a thing. I don't know what this is, right? And when that happened, I did it for a while, but the actual story of how I broke in is bonkers because I was, like I said, I was overseeing Alan Moore, and he was showing me this amazing 12-issue breakdown he has of every character and what they do in each issue. And it just, as we talked, I was like, Alan, I got to tell you, what you're telling me isn't something that I haven't thought about, which bodes well because you're Alan Moore and I'm no one, but I think I could do this. What do you think? And he went, yeah, why not? It's his
Wow.
bloody fault. It's his
There you
fault.
go.
Because that year I went to San Diego Comic-Con and I met the editor of Hellblazer and I was like, hey, do you need a new writer? I heard you did. And they went, yeah, what have you written? I said, well, I haven't actually written anything, but, you want to give it a shot? And like 6 weeks later, they were like, congratulations, you're the new writer of Hellblazer.
Here's my letter of recommendation from Alan Moore.
Well, it wasn't a recommendation. It was his idea. So it's his stupid fault, isn't it?
That's fantastic.
Well, that was a phenomenal run. I mean, one thing that I was thinking about, because prior to this broadcast here, I was doing a little bit of going into the Wayback Machine, reading some older stuff that I have, and looking at the Hellblazer stuff. And when you mentioned you like writing more about people than about the superpowers and the supernatural side of things, and that's exactly what I thought of your Hellblazer run was. It was a very personal run. It really, the best stories were the ones that were about the individuals and just the people.
Because all of those characters are my family. They're all my family and my friends, and they're all of this. And so I want to show you something. Again, it might get me in the heart a little bit, but I'll try to find it as I'm talking. So when I get given Hellblazer, I have no idea what I've just done. I have no idea what's just happened to me. I'm leafing through a book here so I can find something. I have no idea what I've just accomplished, right? They had any number of established comic book professionals like Warren Ellis and people like that. And they picked me.
That's
So
amazing.
yeah. And so, they let me try out and I wrote a few versions of the same, different stories and stuff like that. And then we sort of like, moved on. Right. And the day that I got given the book, I got a phone call from Lou Stathis, who was the editor of Hellblazer. And Lou says, congratulations, you're the new writer of Hellblazer. And it was this moment where I thought, oh, wow, I'm a professional writer. And the first thing they said to me was, okay, so what you have to do, you have to write him in Australia for 2 issues. And I thought, wow, I'm a professional now. I'm going to have to basically do what they asked me to do. And that was crazy, right? Because I hadn't planned on writing professionally, and now suddenly I'm like, I got to write a story in Australia. So now I got to do research about the Australian Aboriginal Dreamtime, and I'm trying to make sense of any of this stuff, right? But I don't know how to do it. And 2 hours after I get the call, I get another call, and one of my best friends is killed in a car accident.
Oh my goodness.
And
Crazy.
and you just go like, I don't know what's just happened to me. Like I'm happy because I've got a new life, but Dini just got killed in a car crash, and I sort of didn't know what to make of it. Right? It was crazy. I can't find the picture. I really wanted to show you the picture of Dini. I just found it after 30 plus years. I hadn't seen it, and it was amazing. But I thought, well, I was gonna write my first arc, but now I want to write one about Dini, and that's when I realized I could do this. The third issue of Hellblazer is about a guy riding his bike in the Battle of Edge Hill, and he gets lost one night. And what the implication is that he probably died somewhere, but he gets trapped inside the psychic spatter of this battle that has been going on since it was one of the worst battles of the Civil War. In fact, more people died at the Battle of Edge Hill, right, in the first day than died on the Somme in the first day. So he gets trapped in there, and John goes and finds him, and Dini's riding his bike, and I got to write my mate riding his bike, and I didn't tell his parents that I was writing him into my third issue, and then I left a copy on his grave, and his mum found it. I didn't even tell her it existed, and she was very, very moved, and it had some closure. So I have always written about myself and everybody in there. Straff and Rich the Punk is my brother, and the Slark is his wife Michelle, and Cider is my nephew, and Ivy is my niece, and my mates are all in there. And so there's this omnibus that's coming out. It's coming out, I think, in June or July. And when you see it, every single issue has a backstory that's listed in the back and says, this is what this issue is actually about. And it's got photos of my friends. It's got photos of my family. The
Oh,
whole
wow.
thing I ever wrote about was the things that I knew. It wasn't about things that I imagined, you know?
So adding your life into those first stories that you've written, it gave you some more experience to be able to
Mm.
continue to do what you're doing. So
Yeah.
that's I think that's fabulous.
And I've done that ever since. I think I write, my feeling is I write about myself for my audience. So I know what I'm writing for them, but I write things that I think they will recognize in themselves. You know, I believe that when you open a book, you actually open a mirror. So you're reflected back, and you see yourself reflected in the characters or the way that they work. That's the way that I work. I don't know. I've got weird and outrageous theories about how this stuff all works, and that's what always stood me in good stead. You know, when I came back to Sentry, what the response has been amazing to the first issue, and people are sort of like, I don't know how he does it. And I'm like, well, I do it the same way that I've always done it, right? It's about us. And I think if you write it about robots, that's a bad way to go. Now, if you can write about us and put robots in it, that's a great way to go in comics.
Um, So one more question from me, and it is the Wolverine question. And if can you walk us through how that came about? Because I know there was this. I don't know why I saw it online a couple of days ago, but there's I guess a not quite true story out there, and I remember seeing a comment from you saying that that's not the way it happened. But I just wanted to say, can you just tell us how that actually came about?
Yeah, it's very simple. It's very simple, I think. And I'm not, I'm not that critical of anybody, and I'm certainly not got much to say about other versions of whatever,
Huh.
but I was there, so I know what happened. It's not that hard either. Basically, understand that when Marvel Knights took off, they gave Joe Quesada the job as editor-in-chief. Because I think we did 4 books of characters that they couldn't give away. They had canceled Daredevil in those days. They had
Yeah.
canceled Daredevil. And Inhumans had never worked for them, and Black Panther never worked for them. So they gave us the crappy characters, I guess you could say, right? And next thing you know, we've won an Eisner, we've got Sales Through the Ceiling, and a book that lasts 50 issues. Out of 3 out of 4 is not bad, right? So they give Joe the job, but understand that Joe and some of the other people there recognized that not only did I know I was doing well and I was having success, I also had spent years in editorial. And Joe called me one time and asked me if I would come and be an editor, but I felt it was very hard for me to go back from being a writer to being an editor. I thought that would have been really hard. But anyway, bottom line, they bring me to the first editorial conference and that Joe has. And it was one of those moments where the history of Marvel had been that when you went to an editorial conference and everyone was gathered, all the troops were gathered, people were getting pink slips. That's how it was in those days. There had been a lot of problems and a lot of people getting pink slips. And so everyone that came to this, like it was like a morning and an afternoon of story ideas and editorial and that with lunch, and it was at Joe's place in New Jersey, Joe and Nancy's place. And you could tell everybody was on edge, well, when's the shoe going to drop? When am I going to get told whether I live or die? Is like Caligula, right? But that wasn't what was happening. And I was just like listening, but I was already listening to what I considered to be a big pile of shit, right? I hated it. I was just sitting there listening, going like, what's going on here? There's like nothing of what I've explained to you right now so far about my process of like why you tell a story. None of that was in the air. It was all stories, but most of what was there was like, no, we can't do that. No, the fans won't like that. No, it was like, no. And I guess I had just sat back and was watching, and Bill Jemas comes up to me at lunch. We're getting a burger, and he sidles up to me to get his burger next to me so he can talk to me. And he said, I remember it so clearly. He said, Paul, you're a very affable guy. You're quite happy. So why are you so grumpy? Why have you got a frown on your face? This is not the way that I see you. So why are you annoyed? And I said, Bill, there's two ways I can answer you, right? I can either tell you the truth or I can blow smoke. And he said, normally, like they always do, well, tell me the truth. And I said, okay, permission to speak freely then. I'm going to swear now. I said, you're supposed to be the house of ideas. So how come every time someone says a good idea, you fucking say no? And he never even blinked. He was like, yeah, I see it. I see it in the editors. I see that they're terrified of their own shadow. I see that this is not going the way that it should do. And I said, like, and this is specifically the conversation I then had with him. I said, I know Grant Morrison, and Grant and I have talked about this a few times. And Grant once said to me, he did Arkham Asylum, right? And it was really successful and everybody loved it. And then when he went to go pitch Arkham Asylum 2, he's always got an editor on the other side going, I'm not so sure, Grant. He's like, why aren't you sure? Why are you not sure at this point that I could write Arkham Asylum 2 and it would be great and we would make money? Why is it always no? Why is it not? And I said, Bill, I feel like this is the same thing. All I'm listening to is people saying no. So every time that you could do something that would be different or rock the status quo, people go, no, you can't do that. You'll alienate the fans. I'm like, you've alienated them pretty well so far so why, why do you care? And he said, well, what do you have in mind? And I said, I think you should do something like the origin of Wolverine. Just like he's walked around for 35 years of his existence, scratching his head, going, I don't know where I came from. Why don't you just do the origin of Wolverine or something like that? But, and I want to be really clear, it was almost like my memory of it was, it's almost like I said, why don't you just do like the origin? He's like, of Wolverine. Like he finished the sentence because he was like, yes, absolutely, we should be doing stuff like that. So we go over, we talk to Joe. Joe does this thing. This is my memory of it. Joe does this thing where he goes, no, we can't do that. And then Bill says, why? And Joe goes, I have no idea. We can do that. Why am I saying no? And so now, Joe and Bill Jemas and myself, I've now got this little 3-person thing. And so after lunch, Bill goes and he stands up and he says some things that I'll never forget because I think he was absolutely right in all the things he said. One of them was, you guys are scared of your shadow. We're not firing you. Another one was marketing. It's very different now, but marketing is not going to drive what we decide to do. You tell us what you want to do and our job is to sell it. And that was very different. And it lasted for 2 or 3 years until that changed. And the other thing he said was like, you keep saying no to stuff. And so I think it was Bill. I can't remember it being Joe, but I may be wrong. It might have been Joe, but I know Bill gave that speech anyway. And then at that point, it was like, we should do the origin of Wolverine. I can't remember if it was Bill or Joe that said it to the group, but there was an uproar. Like, we can't possibly do that. And the question was put to them, why? Why can't you do that? You're just saying that you can't do that. Of course we can. And that's where the origin of Wolverine came from.
It's a great story. I love this inside baseball stuff, guys.
Awesome. This is the best part.
So I guess if we want to just get into what's coming up in Captain Marvel,
Yes.
and then we want to plug that, and then you said you're not that active on socials, but just tell us where we can find you.
I'm somewhat active. I mean, I've got a handle on X, which is where I post information, and I go to there's a couple of Reddit subreddits that I go to. One is for the Sentry. I'll go there and say hi to those people sometimes, but I try not to do Reddit that much. I found already that, when a creator goes into what's essentially a message board, I think it makes people worried, and they want, like, if they want to moan about my work, I want them to be able to moan about my work and say how much they hate me without worrying if I'm in there to embarrass them, or if some of the other people know I'm in there and yell at them because, you know, Paul Jenkins is in this forum, so how dare you say that. So I try not to do like online message boards. Really, I just post on Facebook and that, and I do Substack. And Substack is something I started doing, but people really like it now, so I'm just going to keep doing it and building it out. You know, so let me talk about Captain Marvel.
Is this your first go at Captain Marvel, or is
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah, I've never written her before, and I'm moved and happy that the Carol Corps have accepted me as one of their own, and saying generally that they like the way that I've done her so far, because mostly I've done it the way that I do my work. It's all about who she is as a person. It has requisite comic-y things and, you know, stuff that explodes and people flying, and that's great because I'm not diminishing. I'm not even making fun of it. I'm saying those are the elements that they're like the window dressing that allow you to walk into the store, right? And then when you're in the store, what you're reading is about her. And when they asked me to do her, I sort of looked into the character a little bit and then went, oh yeah, you know, she's been a pilot, she's done all these great things. She's a badass without needing badass powers, right? But there's this thing that I found, some of the older comics especially, was it was a dude's version of feminism. And the tendency with her was for people to kind of go, she punches pretty hard for a girl. And you're like, why does that have anything to do with it? Right? Stop it, you know? So it reminded me, and I had said this in another interview, that I heard this compliment one time of me, which I thought was the most bizarre compliment. I'll take it for the compliment it was meant to be, but I didn't like it because someone said, you're really good at writing women. And I went, they're 50% of the world's population. 51, in fact. And the reason they're 51% of the world's population is because men are stupid and they get killed much more often. So, 50%, I should be able to observe the human condition. I'm married to a woman, believe it or not. You know, my mum is a woman, believe it or not. That seems like the weirdest thing to say. But yeah, I get it. It's a compliment hidden inside a criticism, I suppose. So I was immediately asking myself, you know, how do I write this in such a way that this is the story of her as a Navy pilot, and of her as, you know, I read this whole thing about her and her relationship with her dad, right? And the way that was written was, dad was so misogynist and crazy that she would walk in the door and he'd say, go away, little lady, there's no place for girls here. And I'm like, no one talks like that. You know, like, no, even if dad's a misogynist, he's not exactly going to go that far, right? And so, you know, I wanted to make it be grounded in this relationship between her and her dad. I wanted to make it grounded in something that would be recognizable to anybody who read it, not a female readership, not a male readership. There is no point in writing any character like that. It's simply the way that I see her, and her accomplishments and her challenges as a person. And once we know what her accomplishments have been and what her challenges have been, we can write her with some level of accuracy, and there's some cool stuff to say, right? That's generally the way that I approached it. And the first issue has come out. I think it came out on a Wednesday. It sold out and went back to print on a Thursday. So clearly there's some element of it. A little bit of what I keep getting is, you know, I wasn't going to read Captain Marvel, but I suppose, you know, I'll keep going with this. I'll read this one. And I'm like, well, okay, thank God for small mercies, you know, like at least we've got some stuff, I guess, that people like it.
Yeah, there's a good relationship you wrote with Jessica Drew, you know, since her and Carol close friends.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was
Yeah, I mean, there's this bit. I was very actually self-conscious, but remember, both my editors are women, so you know I have the benefit of being able to ask them. So when I handed that scene in where they're just hanging out and eating food and basically hanging out, I said, a bit self-conscious about this because I'm a bit worried that that it's a dude writing two girls chilling out, right? So please be good editors and just make sure I'm not doing something too stupid. And they were cool because they said, actually, I wrote it pretty well, and they, we made the requisite kind of couple of changes, and that was fine, right? Um, so so when the book came out, I remember getting you can't get what you think you're getting online. There's no sense in going and getting reviews, but you can get a sense of it, But immediately someone went in and went like, yeah, girls never talk like that. And I'm like, I don't know what to do. You can't win that argument because girls never talk like that is a pretty finite statement, isn't it? There's no thing that comes in absolutes. And so you can't necessarily always speak in absolutes. And I felt this is how they would hang out. I don't know. I mean, you're doing your best, right? You're just writing the characters the way you think they would speak.
Is it too early to say whether or not you have a second arc on tap if sales are good, or was it just one arc and done?
I have another story that I would like to do.
Okay.
And I've spoken to them and told them, hey, if it could be done, I would love to do this story. So in a sense, I mean, I would always do that. If you want me to do another story, this is what I would do. Maybe that's the best way of putting it,
Okay. So options open. I will take that.
Yeah.
Okay. Mike, Ken, do you guys have any questions that I might have skipped or anything, or did you think I glossed over anything?
I know I have one, but Mike, do you got one?
So I just want to make more of a comment, just that over the years with your writing, what I really enjoyed is the introspective view of the care of a person's, inside of them, what they're really like. I think that, when Peter David, for whatever reason, I think Marvel kind of mandated it at one point, the whole psychological aspect of the Hulk was pushed aside for the Savage Hulk. And then when you came on after John Byrne and Jerry Ordway's run, you took that psychological aspect and took it to the next level, which I don't think we've seen again since then until Al Ewing got working on Immortal Hulk. But just that side of it, the Sentry, all the internal aspects of it, the stuff that kind of makes you sit afterwards and you can sit and think, it makes you think when you're done reading it. That's what I like about it. I just thought I'd tell you that from all your work on that side, that I've really enjoyed that side of it.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's not that hard for me to do. I think sometimes we think the business side of this is much harder than any of the other sides of this stuff. Getting the project going and all the other things that sort of like come with it is much harder than actually just sitting down and writing the work. That stuff's easy to me,
Okay,
Ken?
so my question is, Paul, so when I informed, we met on the message board, and he answered me very quickly, and I told them, like, yeah, we got Paul Jenkins, creator of the Sentry, he's going to write Captain Marvel, of course, Wolverine Origins, but I asked you on the message board, what is a pod yonker, man? Like, please tell me what it is.
Pod yonkers it's literally comes from my days at Mirage Studios. In Massachusetts, everybody called me Pod, and there was a reason for it. I was once on the phone with a company it was a distributor, and I was trying to get through to a guy called Kelly who worked at this distributor, and the phone is answered, and you're not getting directly through, and this is actually the woman in the front office or whatever, and I said, hi, may I speak with Kelly, please? This is Paul Jenkins from Mirage Studios. And she could not understand my accent, and so I said, well, it's Paul Jenkins, and she goes, it's Paul? And I go, no, it's Paul. Paul? And I'm like, no, look, let me think if I can get this right. And the Beatles, yeah. Well, they got like George and Ringo and John and Paul, like Paul McCartney. And she goes, Paul? And I go, no, look, like, this is a struggle. Like the Pope was John Paul and at the time, right? So, you get it. And, at this point, nobody in the world wouldn't understand that point I've made now. My name is Paul, P-A-U. I even said P-A-U-L, and she goes, P-I-U-L, and no, P-A, right? But, whatever. So the phone gets picked up, and it's this guy, Kelly, and he goes, I say, hey, Kelly, and he goes, who's this? And I says, Paul Jenkins. He goes, oh, my God. She transferred you through as Pod Yonkers from Garage Videos.
Raj video.
I comment with because Bud lives in Massachusetts, and I've recently been sending him a whole bunch of accent videos, TikToks here and there, but I can totally see it.
Yeah, and so Paul Jenkins from Mirage Studios became Pod Yonkers from Garage Videos. And so I tell everybody, and they're like, you don't get to choose your own nickname. You're Pod Yonkers from now on. That was it. My name was Pod Yonkers. Everybody would just leave me a note, hey, Pod, this, and they would call me Pod. And just at Mirage Studios and Tundra, everybody, even to this day, Kevin Eastman would be like, all right, Pod. It's just, that's my name.
You're going to have to put our interview with Pod Yonkers up on.
You have to do it.
Oh, I will. Yes,
up on
I will.
YouTube.
Yes.
Yeah.
What?
It'll be the inside
awesome.
joke. But yeah, when I get excited, I have a habit of dropping my eyes. So
What you going to do? New England, right?
Yeah.
I can't help it.
Yeah.
So,
But all right, ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of the show. Again, special thanks to Paul Jenkins. Again, Sentry 2 is coming out. Captain Marvel, Dark Pass. Go get it. It's a pitch. All you Avengers fans, all you comics fans, and
Just so you know, I have a new series that's coming out as well. I'm doing a new one with Marvel. I haven't announced it yet. Yeah, so
Oh.
that's the third one coming out. Yeah, so things are happening. I'm working at Marvel, and I think if anybody wants to see me online, the best place really is come to my Substack. Actually,
yeah, I will second that. Yeah.
recording.
Yes. Again, ladies and gentlemen, Paul Jenkins.
Yay, thank you, Paul. Appreciate it.